I remember the morning after he left, the particular quality of sunlight streaming through curtains I hadn't closed the night before, the strange silence in rooms that suddenly felt too large, the coffee cup I made out of habit and set on the table where he used to sit. Some say that endings happen in a moment, a door closing, a phone hanging up, a message left unread. But the truth is, endings keep happening long after the final goodbye. They happen when you reach across the bed at night and find emptiness, when you cook a meal and set the table for two before remembering, when you hear a joke and turn to share it with someone who is no longer there. Perhaps you know this continuation of ending too, the way abandonment doesn't arrive all at once but unfolds in layers, revealing new dimensions of absence you hadn't anticipated. The way being left behind isn't a single moment but a landscape you must learn to navigate one step at a time. My sister, I see you standing at the beginning of this journey, perhaps still in shock, perhaps already moving through the storms of grief, perhaps somewhere between disbelief and acceptance. I see the questions in your eyes. How do I begin again? How do I rebuild what has been torn down? How do I find myself in this aftermath? Today, I want to speak to the part of you that knows, even through the pain, that this ending, however unwanted, however unfair, is not the final chapter of your story. I want to speak to the wisdom in your bones that understands, even before your heart can accept it, that being left is not the same as being lost. Because what I have learned, walking this path myself, is that beginning again after abandonment isn't about erasing what was. It's about honoring the wound while refusing to be defined by it. It's about discovering that your capacity for joy, for meaning, for purpose, even for love remains intact, waiting patiently beneath the rubble of what has fallen. This new beginning will not arrive in a single moment either. It will come to you in glimpses and whispers, in small acts of courage that no one else may see, in quiet decisions to turn toward life, even when grief pulls in the opposite direction. And though it may be impossible to imagine now, the day will come when you will look back and recognize that what felt like an ending became, through your own resilience, the doorway to a life more authentic, more fully yours than any you had previously known. This is not a journey anyone would choose, but it is a journey that has been walked by countless hearts before you, hearts that discovered, as you will, that being left behind is not the end of your becoming, but a painful, powerful passage into who you were always meant to be. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives the day after someone walks away from your life. Not the peaceful quiet of solitude you've chosen, but the hollowed-out hush of absence that has chosen you. A silence that seems to have weight and substance, that fills rooms once animated by another's presence, that settles over your world like dust after a storm has passed. I remember moving through my home the day after he left, touching objects we had chosen together, looking at photographs that suddenly seemed to document a world that no longer existed. I remember the disorienting sensation of inhabiting spaces that looked exactly as they had the day before, while everything essential had changed. The kitchen was the same kitchen, the living room was the same living room, but they had become museums of a life that was over. Perhaps you know this strange territory too. The way familiar surroundings become suddenly unfamiliar when viewed through the lens of abandonment. The way ordinary tasks, making the bed, preparing a meal, checking the mail, become exercises in remembering what has been lost. The way time itself seems to move differently, sometimes sluggish, sometimes racing, but never quite matching the rhythm your days once followed. This is the landscape of the day after, the gray zone between what was and what will be. The liminal space where the reality of abandonment begins to settle into your bones, even as part of you still expects the door to open, the phone to ring, the person who left to return and restore the world that has been shattered. My sister, I want you to know that whatever you feel in this aftermath is valid. Whether it's numbness or rage, despair or relief, confusion or clarity, or most likely, a storm system of emotions moving through you in waves that follow no predictable pattern. There is no correct way to experience abandonment. There is only your way, your truth, your particular heart coming to terms with a reality you didn't choose. In these early days, the mind often becomes a time machine, moving compulsively between past and future while struggling to remain in the painful present. You may find yourself obsessively reviewing memories, looking for signs you missed, things you could have done differently, ways you might have prevented this ending. Or you may find yourself racing ahead, trying to imagine how you will possibly build a life from these ruins, how you will face the days and weeks and years that once included someone who is now gone. This movement between what was and what will be is natural. It is your mind's attempt to make sense of what has happened, to create a narrative that might contain this pain, to find solid ground in the midst of earthquake. But it can also become an escape from the necessary reckoning of the present moment, the simple, difficult truth that today, right now, this is where you are. The day after abandonment, whether it's literally the day after someone walked away, or the emotional day after when the reality finally breaks through your defenses, asks something profound of you. It asks you to be present with what is without knowing what will be, to acknowledge the ending without yet being able to envision a new beginning, to feel the full impact of being left without immediately rushing to fill the space that has been vacated. This is not easy. Every instinct may urge you toward distraction, toward numbing, toward busy activity that keeps the full reality at bay, or toward desperate attempts to undo what has happened. The repeated calls, the pleading messages, the bargaining with fate or God or the person who has chosen to leave. These are natural responses, common waypoints on this journey. If you've traveled these roads, be gentle with yourself. They are part of the territory. But I want to offer you another possibility for this day after, something I wish someone had offered me when I stood where you stand now. What if this painful present moment, this aftermath of abandonment, is not just something to endure or escape? What if it also contains an invitation, not one you would have chosen, but powerful nonetheless? An invitation to meet yourself in this broken, open place, to discover what remains when what you thought was essential has gone. To begin the gradual process of distinguishing between what has been lost and what is truly yours, your values, your dreams, your capacity for meaning that no abandonment can take away. This doesn't mean rushing toward false positivity or premature resolution. It doesn't mean pretending the pain isn't real or that grief isn't necessary. It simply means recognizing that even in this devastated landscape of the day after, seeds of your future self are present, dormant perhaps, but waiting. I remember the moment, weeks into my own aftermath, when I realized I had made it through an entire day without crying. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because I had begun, imperceptibly, to adapt to its presence. I remember the first time I rearranged the furniture, not to erase the memory of what had been, but to create a space that acknowledged both the absence and my continuing presence within it. I remember the afternoon. I found myself humming a tune while washing dishes, and how startled I was to discover that pleasure, however small, was still accessible even in the midst of heartbreak. These moments didn't erase what had happened. They didn't undo the abandonment or instantly heal its wounds. But they were tiny signposts, almost imperceptible at the time, that pointed toward a truth I wasn't yet ready to fully embrace. That life was continuing, not as I had planned it, but continuing nonetheless. And I was still here to witness it, to participate in it, to gradually shape what it might become. My sister, the day after abandonment feels like an ending, and in many ways, it is. A chapter has closed. A future you had imagined has disappeared. A relationship that shaped your days is over. This is real loss that deserves to be honored. But what I have learned, what countless others who have walked this path before you have learned, is that the day after is also, paradoxically, The first step in a journey you didn't choose, but that may lead you to places within yourself you never would have discovered otherwise. Not today, not tomorrow, not while the wound is still fresh and bleeding, but gradually, imperceptibly at first, and then with gathering momentum as you continue to choose life one moment at a time, even in the shadow of having been left behind. The day after abandonment asks you to begin before you're ready, to take one breath and then another without knowing where they will lead, to stand in the ruins without yet having a blueprint for what will be rebuilt. And in that beginning, messy, painful, authentic, the first seeds of your new life are already being planted, though you may not see their growth for seasons to come. There comes a moment in the aftermath of abandonment when you catch a glimpse of your reflection, perhaps in a mirror, perhaps in a window, perhaps in the compassionate eyes of a friend who has stayed, and barely recognize the person looking back at you. The face is familiar, but something has changed. Something in the eyes, in the set of the mouth, in the way you hold yourself in the world. This is the strange alchemy of being left behind. The way it changes not just your circumstances, but your sense of who you are. The way it forces you to confront questions you may have never needed to ask before. Who am I now that I am no longer someone's partner, someone's chosen one? What defines me now that this relationship no longer does? What remains of my identity when such a significant piece has been torn away? I remember standing before the bathroom mirror weeks after he left, really seeing myself for the first time since the leaving. I hardly knew the woman who gazed back at me, her eyes shadowed with grief, her face somehow both older and younger than I remembered. "Who are you now?" I whispered to her. And for a moment, I genuinely didn't know the answer. Perhaps you've had this disorienting encounter with your own changed reflection. Perhaps you've experienced the vertigo that comes with suddenly questioning an identity you had thought was solid. Perhaps you too have wondered if being left means being diminished, less whole, less worthy, less yourself than you were before the abandonment. My sister, I want to speak to this fear directly, this terror that in losing a relationship, you have also lost essential parts of yourself, that in being left behind, you have somehow been lessened, that the broken pieces of what was can never again form something whole and beautiful. Here is what I have learned about finding yourself in the aftermath. You have not been diminished, you have been disrupted. And though the pain of that disruption is real and significant, it has not reduced who you are. It has revealed who you are. Think of a kaleidoscope. When you turn it, the same pieces rearrange themselves into new patterns, not because anything has been added or taken away, but because the relationship between the elements has changed. This is what happens in the wake of abandonment. The essential elements of who you are remain, but their configuration shifts. Your understanding of yourself in relation to others, to your own history, to the future you had planned, all of this undergoes a profound reorganization. And in this reorganization, difficult as it is, lies an opportunity that often only becomes visible with time and distance. The chance to rediscover yourself apart from the definitions and expectations that shaped your identity within the relationship that has ended. I spent years defining myself as his partner, adapting to his preferences, organizing my life around our shared routines and rituals. When he left, it wasn't just his presence I lost, but the particular version of myself I had become in relation to him. The ways I had grown to accommodate our togetherness, the aspects of myself I had emphasized or minimized to maintain our balance, the identity I had constructed as part of a we that no longer existed. In the early aftermath, this felt only like loss. But as months passed, as the initial devastation began to recede, I started to notice something unexpected emerging from the rubble, glimpses of a self I had almost forgotten, passions I had set aside, dreams I had postponed, ways of moving through the world that had been subtly shaped by another's expectations rather than my own deepest knowing. Finding your reflection in broken glass isn't about discovering that you've been shattered beyond repair. It's about seeing yourself refracted differently, catching unexpected angles, noticing aspects of your being that were always there, but perhaps obscured by the particular light of the relationship that has ended. This doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single moment of revelation, but a gradual process of recollection and discovery. A slow gathering of the pieces, not to recreate what was, but to allow a new configuration to emerge, one that honors both what you've lost and what you've found. One that incorporates the growth and wisdom that come through loving and losing, while creating space for aspects of yourself that may have been waiting patiently for expression. In practical terms, this process often begins with simple questions. What did I love before this relationship? What made me feel alive? What dreams did I carry that got set aside along the way? What parts of myself have I missed without even realizing they were gone? For me, it was returning to early morning solitude, something I had largely abandoned because he preferred late nights and lazy mornings. It was rediscovering my love of certain books, certain music, certain foods that had gradually disappeared from our shared life. It was remembering how I had once moved through the world with a curiosity and openness that had slowly contracted within the familiar orbits of couplehood. None of this erased the pain of being left. None of it made the abandonment somehow worth it or part of some grand cosmic plan. But it did reveal that alongside the very real loss was another truth, that parts of myself that had gone dormant were still alive, still available, still capable of bringing meaning and even joy if I had the courage to reclaim them. My sister, as you search for your reflection in the broken glass of what was, remember that what you're looking for isn't a return to who you were before the relationship, nor is it a continuation of who you were within it. You're looking for who you are now, shaped by both the love and its ending, marked by the pain but not defined by it, carrying the lessons of what has happened while remaining open to what hasn't yet been discovered. This self, the one emerging from the aftermath, is not less than who you were before. She is more, not despite the breaking, but because of what the breaking has revealed. Not because abandonment is a gift, it isn't, but because your response to it, your continued choosing of life, even when that life looks nothing like what you had planned, is creating a depth and resilience that wasn't possible before. The reflection you'll gradually come to recognize in the broken glass isn't just who you were all along beneath the roles and expectations of the relationship. It's also who you are becoming through this unwanted but transformative journey. Someone who knows the taste of both honey and vinegar, who has felt the ground disappear beneath her feet and discovered she could still stand, who has been left behind and learned that she was never actually lost. This doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen through positive thinking or forced gratitude or pretending the pain isn't real. It happens through honest reckoning with both what has been taken and what remains. It happens through allowing yourself to grieve what is genuinely gone while staying curious about what might be waiting to be discovered. And it happens through a gradual shift in the questions you ask yourself, from "why did this happen to me?" to "who am I now that this has happened?" From "how do I get back what I've lost?" to "what does this experience make possible that wasn't possible before?" These aren't questions with simple answers. They're invitations to a dialogue with yourself that will unfold over time, revealing different truths at different stages of your healing. They're companions for the journey of finding your reflection not in a single perfect mirror, but in the beautiful broken mosaic of a life that continues to evolve through both joy and sorrow, both connection and loss, both being chosen and being left behind. The woman you'll gradually come to recognize in that mosaic may surprise you. She is stronger than you knew, more resilient than you imagined, more complex and interesting, and capable of growth than any version of yourself that existed before the breaking. Not because abandonment improved you, it didn't, but because your response to it, your continued presence with both the pain and the possibility, is revealing dimensions of your humanity that might have remained dormant in a less challenging life. My sister, you were worthy before this person left. You are worthy now that they're gone. And the reflection you're seeking in the broken glass isn't proof of that worthiness. It's simply your own face, seen more clearly than ever before, through the tears and the transformation of being the one who remained when another chose to leave. There are certain spaces that become almost unnavigable in the wake of abandonment. The side of the bed where they used to sleep, the chair where they always Saturday, the kitchen on Sunday mornings when you used to make breakfast together, the holiday traditions that were meant to be shared, the future you had planned that now gapes like an empty stage, waiting for a play that will never be performed. These empty spaces exist both in your physical environment and in the geography of your days. They are the vacant lots where something meaningful once stood, the silence where conversation used to flow, the blank spaces in your calendar that were meant to be filled with shared experiences. At first, these empty spaces feel like wounds, raw, tender places you try to avoid or move past quickly. You may find yourself sleeping only on one side of the bed, as though the other remains invisibly occupied. You may take a different route home to avoid passing places that hold too many memories. You may find yourself unable to enter certain rooms at certain times of day because the emptiness feels too confrontational, too much like looking directly at the loss. I remember the restaurant I couldn't visit for over a year because it had been our favorite place. The songs I had to skip because they had been the soundtrack to moments that no longer existed. The entire month of December that became a minefield of traditions suddenly rendered hollow by his absence. These avoidances are natural in the early stages of grief. They are the heart's way of creating a buffer between itself and pain too intense to bear all at once. They are part of the necessary numbness that allows you to function when the full reality of loss would be overwhelming. But there comes a time in the healing journey when these empty spaces begin to call for something different, not for continued avoidance, but for a gradual, intentional reclamation. A reclaiming not just of physical locations or time slots in your calendar, but of your right to exist fully in all the territories of your own life, even those that were once shared. This reclamation doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't happen through forced positive thinking or premature declarations that you're over it when the pain is still acute. It happens through small acts of presence, tiny decisions to show up for yourself in spaces that feel empty, gradual movements toward rather than away from the geographies of loss. I remember the first time I deliberately slept in the middle of the bed, claiming the entire space as my own, rather than preserving an empty half for a body that wasn't coming back. I remember the evening I returned to our favorite restaurant, not to erase the memories, but to create a new association. The night I dined alone and discovered I could enjoy my own company in a place that had once belonged to us. I remember the December I decided to keep the Bractent. Traditions that still held meaning for me while consciously creating new ones that belonged solely to my present rather than to a past that could not be recovered. None of these actions erased the loss. None of them pretended the abandonment hadn't happened or that it didn't still hurt. But each represented a small reclamation, a way of saying to myself and to the empty spaces, this too is mine. Not just the memories of what happened here, but the present moment and the possibility it contains. My sister, the spaces left empty by abandonment will never be filled in exactly the same way again. That particular presence, that specific relationship, that unique connection, these cannot be replaced or replicated. And there's a kind of peace that comes with acknowledging this truth, with stopping the desperate search for something or someone to make the emptiness disappear. But what can change, what does change with time and intention, is your relationship with the emptiness itself. What once felt like an unbearable void gradually becomes a space of possibility. What once seemed like evidence of your abandonment slowly transforms into proof of your resilience. your capacity to remain present even in places that hold pain, your willingness to create meaning even where meaning has been disrupted. This transformation begins with tiny acts of reclamation, lighting a candle in a room you've been avoiding, preparing a beautiful meal just for yourself at the table where you used to dine together, playing music that once belonged to us and allowing it to become part of a new soundtrack, one that acknowledges both what has been lost and what continues. Sometimes reclamation involves physical changes to your environment, rearranging furniture, repainting walls, replacing objects that carry too much painful history with new ones that reflect your current journey. Not to erase the past, but to create a physical space that honors both where you've been and where you're going. Other times, reclamation is more internal, a shift in how you think about certain dates, places, activities that once belonged to the relationship, a conscious decision to revisit a place that holds memories, but to bring your full present self to the experience rather than remaining trapped in what was. I remember the anniversary that had always been celebrated during our years together. The first year after he left, I spent it in hiding, pretending it was just another day while feeling the weight of its significance like a stone in my chest. The second year, I decided to reclaim it, not as the anniversary of our relationship, but as a day to celebrate my own journey of healing. I took myself to a beautiful outdoor space, wrote in my journal about how far I had come, and made intentional plans for the year ahead. The date still held meaning, but the meaning had transformed. This is what reclamation looks like, not denying the empty spaces or the pain they represent, but gradually, deliberately changing your relationship with them, finding ways to honor what was valuable about what happened in those spaces while refusing to allow abandonment to render parts of your life permanently uninhabitable. And as you engage in these acts of reclamation, something surprising begins to happen. The empty spaces, while never filled in exactly the same way again, begin to hold new possibilities. New meanings emerge in places that once seemed defined entirely by absence. New experiences become layered over the old ones, not erasing them but adding complexity, dimension, the texture of a life that continues to unfold even after significant loss. You discover that you can hold both the memory of what these spaces once contained and the reality of what they hold now, that your heart is spacious enough for both grief and renewal, both honoring what was lost and creating what comes next. This doesn't mean the empty spaces ever completely lose their association with what happened there. Certain songs may always remind you of specific moments. Certain places may always carry an echo of shared experiences. Certain dates may always prompt reflection on what was and what might have been. But with time and intentional reclamation, these associations lose their power to derail your present. They become integrated into the larger story of your life, rather than remaining radioactive zones you must avoid. They become part of the complex geography of a heart that has known both abandonment and resilience, both loss and reclamation, both endings and new beginnings. My sister, the spaces left empty in your life are not evidence of your diminishment. They are not proof that you have been permanently reduced by abandonment. They are simply places where something has ended and where something else, though you may not yet be able to imagine it, has the possibility to begin. Reclaim these spaces at your own pace, in your own way. There is no correct timeline, no perfect method, no universal approach to this aspect of healing. There is only your honest relationship with your own journey, your willingness to acknowledge both the pain of what has been lost and your right to continue creating a meaningful life in the wake of that loss. And know this, each small act of reclamation, each tiny step into a space that once felt defined by absence, isn't just about changing your relationship with physical locations or dates on a calendar. It's about reclaiming your right to fully inhabit your own life, every room of it, every day of it, every possibility it contains, regardless of who has chosen to remain and who has chosen to leave. There comes a time in the journey after abandonment when you stand in the landscape of your life and see what feels like devastation all around you. Plans that will never materialize. Dreams you shared that have gone up in smoke. Trust that has been incinerated by betrayal or broken promises, or simply the shock of discovering that what you thought was solid could disappear without warning. In these moments, the terrain of your future can look like scorched earth, a place where nothing could possibly grow again, where the very soil of your life seems hostile to new possibility. I remember this bleak geography all too well. The days when I would look ahead and see nothing but a wasteland where once there had been gardens of possibility. The moments when I genuinely believed that certain capacities within me, for trust, for intimacy, for hope, had been permanently destroyed by the fire of abandonment. Perhaps you know this landscape too. Perhaps you've stood in this same scorched territory, looking at the remains of what was and wondering how anything new could ever take root in ground so thoroughly burned. Perhaps you've questioned whether you have the energy, the courage, the sheer will to begin planting again when the last harvest was lost so painfully. My sister, I want to share with you what I've learned about this scorched earth time. This period that feels like absolute devastation, but is actually, though you cannot see it yet, the necessary clearing before new growth becomes possible. First, this scorched earth is not the permanent condition of your life, though it may feel that way now. It is a season, a difficult, painful season, but a temporary one nonetheless. Just as forests eventually regenerate after wildfire, just as prairies depend on periodic burning to maintain their health, just as volcanic soils eventually become some of the most fertile on Earth, this devastation is not the end of the story. Second, beneath what looks like complete destruction, life is already preparing to return. Seeds that can withstand fire are waiting in the soil. Roots that run deeper than the burning has reached are gathering resources for new growth. Organisms too small to see are beginning the work of renewal long before any visible evidence appears on the surface. This is true in the natural world, and it is true in the landscape of your heart after abandonment. Beneath the visible devastation, beneath the pain that seems all-encompassing, the conditions for new life are already being established. Your capacity for joy has not been permanently destroyed. Your ability to trust has not been burned beyond recovery. Your heart's fertility has not been rendered forever barren by this fire. But this renewal doesn't happen through forced positivity or premature planting. It doesn't come from rushing to replace what was lost or immediately seeking a substitute for what has been taken. It comes through a gradual, intentional process of preparing the ground, and then, when the time is right, planting seeds that have the possibility to grow into something entirely new, not a replica of what was lost, but a different kind of garden altogether. The preparing of the ground begins with honest acknowledgement of the devastation, not minimizing it, not pretending it didn't happen, not rushing to cover it up with false cheer or hasty replacement, but allowing yourself to survey the full extent of what has been lost, to feel the grief of it, to honor the dreams that will never materialize, to recognize the very real pain of standing in a landscape that bears little resemblance to the one you had planned to inhabit. This honest reckoning isn't wallowing or self-pity. It's a necessary process of coming to terms with reality, of seeing clearly what is, rather than continuing to focus on what might have been. It's the emotional equivalent of turning over burned soil, bringing air and light to what has been covered, beginning the slow work of making the ground receptive to new seeds. After this acknowledgement comes the gradual work of enrichment, finding sources of nourishment for soil that has been depleted by fire. In practical terms, this looks like reconnecting with people who love you, not for what you can give them, but for who you essentially are. It looks like returning to activities that have reliably fed your soul in the past, whether that's time in nature, creative expression, spiritual practice, or embodied movement. It looks like caring for your physical needs with the same tenderness you would offer a child recovering from illness, nutrition, rest, gentle movement, permission to heal at your own pace. These aren't distractions from grief. They're not attempts to fix what has happened or to rush the natural process of healing. They're acts of enrichment, ways of gradually restoring nutrients to soil that has been through fire, preparing it to eventually support new growth. And then, when the time is right, not according to anyone else's timeline, but according to the wisdom of your own heart, comes the actual planting. The tentative reaching toward new possibilities, the cautious investment in dreams that belong entirely to your future rather than to your past. This planting is both a practical and a spiritual act. It involves making concrete choices, saying yes to an invitation, pursuing a long dormant interest, creating something that reflects your current reality rather than the one you had planned. But it's also an act of faith, a declaration that despite evidence to the contrary, you still believe in the possibility of growth, of beauty, of meaning beyond what has been lost. I remember the day I realized I was ready to plant something new in the scorched earth of my own life. It wasn't a dramatic moment. I didn't wake up feeling healed or magically free from grief. I simply found myself enrolling in a class I had always wanted to take but had postponed during my relationship. It was a small seed, just 6 weeks of learning something new, but it represented a significant shift. I was investing in a future that was entirely my own, one that didn't depend on the presence of the person who had left. That first seed led to others. The class connected me to new people who knew me only as I was now, not as part of the couple I had been. One of those connections led to an opportunity I would never have pursued in my previous life. That opportunity opened doors I hadn't known existed, and gradually, imperceptibly at first, but with gathering momentum, new growth began to appear in what had felt like irrevocably damaged terrain. Not all at once, not without setbacks and difficult days when the scorched earth seemed to reassert itself, not in a straight line of constant progress, but genuinely, persistently, with a life force that couldn't be permanently extinguished even by the fire of abandonment. My sister, I don't know what seeds will be right for the particular soil of your life. I don't know what form your renewal will take or what timeline it will follow. These are discoveries you'll make through your own process of honest reckoning, patient enrichment, and cautious, courageous planting. But I do know this: the scorched earth you stand on now is not the final state of your life's landscape. The fire of abandonment, painful as it is, has not permanently destroyed your capacity for growth, for beauty, for meaning beyond what has been lost. And the seeds you eventually plant in this burned-over ground may grow into something more authentic, more aligned with your deepest nature, more genuinely yours than anything that could have flourished in the garden you had planned with someone who ultimately chose not to tend it with you. This isn't because abandonment is a gift. It isn't because everything happens for a reason or because the universe had some better plan that required your heart to be broken. It's simply because human beings, like certain landscapes in the natural world, have the remarkable capacity to regenerate after fire, not unchanged, not unmarked by what has happened, but also not permanently diminished by it. The new growth that emerges from this scorched earth time won't erase what happened. It won't make the abandonment somehow worth it in some cosmic calculation of pain and reward. But it will gradually transform your relationship with what happened, from a devastation that defines everything about your life to one significant chapter in a continuing story of resilience, renewal, and meaning that refuses to be limited by someone else's choice to leave. Plant slowly, plant carefully. Plant only what genuinely calls to your heart, not what you think you should want or what others tell you will fix everything. And trust the deep wisdom of your own nature, a wisdom that knows, even when your conscious mind doubts it, that life continues to seek expression, Even in the most burned-over landscapes, that new growth remains possible, even after the most devastating fires. There will come a day, impossible to predict in timing but certain to arrive, when you will notice something growing in the landscape of your life that was not planted by grief. Something that belongs not to what was lost but to what is being found. Something that represents not the continuation of pain but the beginning of a new season in your own unfolding story. It might be small at first, a moment of spontaneous laughter that catches you by surprise, an interest in something that has nothing to do with your past relationship, a dream about the future that doesn't include the person who left, a day when you realize you haven't thought about the abandonment for hours at a time. These first blooms often appear when we least expect them, sometimes even before we believe we're ready for them. They emerge not from forced positivity or artificial timelines for moving on, but from the natural resilience of a heart that, despite everything, has not forgotten how to seek life. I remember the evening I found myself deeply engaged in conversation at a dinner party, genuinely interested in the people around me, fully present in the moment, rather than half absent in memories or regrets. It was only later, driving home, that I realized I had spent hours without the familiar weight of abandonment pressing on my chest. I hadn't been consciously trying to feel better or move on. I had simply been alive in the moment, and that aliveness had temporarily suspended the grief that had become so familiar. That first bloom didn't mean the winter of loss was completely over. There were still difficult days ahead, still moments when the pain felt as fresh as it had in the beginning. But it represented something significant nonetheless, evidence that my capacity for engagement, for connection, for interest in the world beyond my own hurt had not been permanently destroyed by being left behind. These first signs of renewal are often met with complicated emotions. There can be a sweetness to them, the relief of discovering that joy is still accessible, that life still holds genuine interest, that beauty can still move you even after significant loss. But they can also trigger guilt, confusion, even fear, as though allowing new growth somehow dishonors what was lost or makes you vulnerable to future abandonment. You might find yourself holding back from fully embracing these first blooms, checking your enjoyment as though happiness has become a dangerous indulgence, questioning whether you've earned the right to feel anything other than grief, wondering if allowing new possibility means you're over a relationship that was once central to your life. My sister, if you recognize these hesitations in yourself, I want to offer you the permission that no one else can give, but that you deeply deserve. You are allowed to embrace the signs of renewal when they appear in your life. You are allowed to welcome the first blooms of your new season, not as betrayals of what mattered, but as evidence of your own irrepressible capacity for life. Feeling joy again doesn't mean the relationship wasn't significant. Discovering new interests doesn't erase the value of what you shared. Building a different kind of life doesn't diminish the authenticity of the love you felt or the pain of its ending. It simply means that you are more than your losses, that your capacity for meaning, for connection, for purpose and pleasure hasn't been permanently defined by someone's choice to leave. These first blooms aren't about getting over the relationship or moving on as though it never happened. They're about integration, about allowing what happened to take its place as part of your story rather than its conclusion. They're about discovering that your heart is spacious enough to hold both the honoring of what was lost and the embracing of what is being found. As these first signs of renewal begin to appear, you may notice changes in how you relate to the abandonment itself. What once occupied the entirety of your emotional landscape gradually becomes one significant feature among others. What once defined every moment of your days slowly takes its place as one chapter in a continuing story. What once felt like the end of everything meaningful gradually reveals itself as a painful but not terminal disruption in a life that remains in progress. This shift doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't proceed in a straight line. There will be days when the new blooms seem to disappear, when the landscape reverts to the barrenness of early grief. There will be triggers that temporarily return you to the raw pain of being left behind, anniversaries, encounters with the person who left, experiences that echo what you once shared. But even in these returns to grief, something has changed. The pain, while still real, no longer defines the entirety of who you are. The abandonment, while still significant, no longer determines everything about what's possible for you. The person who left, while still someone who mattered deeply, no longer holds the power to decide whether your life can contain meaning, connection, even joy. I remember the first holiday season after I began to notice signs of renewal in my own life. There were still moments of acute grief, still comparisons between what was and what might have been. But alongside these familiar pains were new experiences, connections with friends who had stood by me through the worst times, traditions I had created that belonged entirely to my present rather than to my past, a sense of my own resilience that hadn't existed in quite the same way before being tested by abandonment. The landscape wasn't uniformly blooming. There were still bare patches, still signs of what had been burned away, but it was no longer the scorched earth of early grief either. It had become something more complex, more textured, a terrain that contained both the reality of loss and the evidence of renewal, both the memory of what had ended and the emergence of what was just beginning. This is the nature of healing after abandonment. Not a linear progression from pain to restoration, not a complete erasure of what happened, but a gradual integration that allows both the wound and the growth it eventually catalyzed to be acknowledged as part of the same continuing life. The first blooms of your new season don't require you to pretend the winter never happened. They don't ask you to deny the reality of what was lost. They simply invite you to notice that alongside the grief, alongside the legitimate pain of being left behind, life is still reaching toward light, still seeking expression through you, still offering possibilities that belong not to the past, but to the future that continues to unfold. My sister, when these first signs of renewal appear in your life, when you find yourself genuinely interested in something new, when you experience pleasure that doesn't feel shadowed by loss, when you notice dreams emerging that have nothing to do with the relationship that ended, receive them not as betrayals of what mattered, but as evidence of your own sacred resilience. Not because abandonment is a gift, not because breaking was somehow necessary for this new growth, but because the human heart, like nature itself, contains an irrepressible tendency toward life, a capacity for renewal that persists even through the harshest seasons, a commitment to continuation that remains even when conscious hope has temporarily disappeared. The first bloom of your new season isn't the end of your healing journey. It's simply evidence that the journey continues, that despite everything, despite the shock and pain of being left behind, your story is still being written. Not by the person who chose to leave, but by the one who had the courage to remain present to both the devastation and the renewal, both the ending and the beginning, both the loss and the discovery that awaited on the other side of that necessary grief. There will come a time in your journey after abandonment, not tomorrow, perhaps not even next year, but eventually, when you realize that you have been walking forward for quite some time without constantly looking over your shoulder at what was left behind. When the path ahead commands more of your attention than the territory you've already traversed, when the future calls to you more powerfully than the past, this doesn't happen suddenly. There's no single moment when grief ends and renewal definitively begins. No clear line of demarcation between the landscape of loss and the terrain of new possibility. No dramatic transformation that erases all traces of what happened and who you were when it happened to you. Instead, this shift occurs gradually, almost imperceptibly, through countless small choices to turn toward life rather than away from it. through tiny acts of engagement with your present circumstances rather than continued dwelling in what might have been, through modest investments in possibilities that belong entirely to your future rather than to a past that cannot be recovered. I remember noticing, about 2 years after he left, that I had gone an entire week without thinking about the relationship. Not because I had forced myself not to remember, not because I had suppressed the grief or denied the significance of what had happened, but simply because my life had gradually filled with other matters that commanded my attention, other relationships that engaged my heart, other purposes that called forth my energy and commitment. This wasn't a betrayal of what had been important. It wasn't a sign that the love had meant nothing, or that the pain of its ending had been exaggerated. It was simply evidence of something equally important, that my capacity for engagement with life hadn't ended when that relationship did. That abandonment, while painful and significant, hadn't defined the entirety of who I was or what was possible for me. My sister, this gradual shift from looking back to walking forward isn't about forgetting what happened. It isn't about pretending you were never hurt or that the abandonment didn't matter. It isn't about erasing the relationship from your history or denying the impact it had on who you've become. It's about integration rather than erasure, about allowing what happened to take its place as part of your story rather than remaining the central organizing principle of your identity. About recognizing that while abandonment shaped you, it didn't stop your becoming. While it wounded you, it didn't define you. While it ended something significant, it didn't end everything that matters. This integration doesn't happen through forced forgetting or artificial closure. It happens through honest acknowledgement of both what was valuable about what you lost and what remains possible despite that loss. It happens through the gradual discovery that your heart is spacious enough to hold both the honoring of what happened and the embracing of what continues to unfold. Walking forward without constantly looking back doesn't mean never glancing over your shoulder. There will still be moments when memory surfaces unexpectedly, still occasions when something triggers awareness of what was and what might have been, still times when the absence makes itself felt even years after the leaving. But these moments, while still carrying emotional charge, no longer define the landscape of your days. They no longer determine your capacity for joy, for connection, for purpose beyond what was lost. They take their place among the many experiences that have shaped you, rather than remaining the single event that seems to overshadow everything else. This shift in perspective, from abandonment as the central fact of your life to abandonment as one significant chapter in a continuing story, doesn't happen through the mere passage of time. It happens through engaged living, through conscious choice to remain open to what life continues to offer even after significant loss, through the daily decision to turn toward possibility rather than remaining fixated on what cannot be changed. In practical terms, this looks like investing in relationships that reflect who you are now rather than who you were in the past. It looks like pursuing interests that genuinely call to your present self rather than attempting to recreate what was meaningful in the relationship that ended. It looks like making choices based on your current values and desires rather than in reaction to or defense against what happened when you were left behind. I remember the day I realized I was making decisions about my life not in relation to the abandonment, not to prove something to the person who left, not to ensure I would never be hurt that way again, not to compensate for what had been taken, but simply because those choices resonated with who I had become through the entire journey of loving, losing, and gradually discovering what remained possible on the other side of that necessary grief. That recognition didn't mean the abandonment had never happened or that it hadn't significantly shaped me. It simply meant that its power to determine my next steps had diminished. That I was walking forward not in denial of the past, but in genuine engagement with the present. Not because I had forced myself to move on, but because life itself had gradually moved me toward new possibilities, new connections, new ways of being that were no longer defined primarily by what had been lost. My sister, as you continue on this journey after abandonment, know that this shift from looking back to walking forward isn't something you achieve through sheer willpower or forced positive thinking. It's something that happens naturally when you remain open to life's continued unfolding, when you allow yourself to be genuinely present to what each day offers, rather than constantly comparing it to what might have been. This doesn't mean pretending the past didn't matter. It doesn't mean denying the reality of your grief or the significance of what was lost. It simply means recognizing that the past, while real and important, isn't the only terrain that exists. That alongside the landscape of what has ended lies the equally real territory of what continues, what emerges, what becomes possible when you're no longer defining yourself primarily as someone who was left behind. Walking forward without constantly looking back isn't about reaching some perfect state of healing, where the abandonment never crosses your mind, or where the relationship has been neatly filed away in the archives of your history. It's about integration, about allowing what happened to take its place among the many experiences that have shaped you without allowing it to overshadow everything else that matters. And it's about recognizing that the most profound response to having been left isn't to remain forever defined by that leaving. It's to continue becoming, to allow your life to keep unfolding in ways that honor both what has shaped you and what you are shaping now. To remain engaged with the mystery of your own continuing story rather than believing that the most significant chapters have already been written. The abandonment changed you. This is true and will always be true, but it didn't stop your becoming. It didn't have the final word on who you are or what your life will hold. It was a significant chapter, but it wasn't the conclusion of your story. And as you walk forward, gradually turning your gaze more toward what lies ahead than what was left behind, you honor not just your capacity for healing, but your commitment to living fully, authentically, with a heart that has known both breaking and mending, both abandonment and renewal, both endings and the countless beginnings that continue to unfold when we remain open to life's invitation to keep becoming, keep discovering, keep walking forward into what remains possible, even after significant loss. My sister, your journey continues, not despite what has happened, but with it fully integrated into the complex, beautiful tapestry of a life that refuses to be defined by any single thread, even one as significant as having been left behind. Walk forward not in denial of the past, but in genuine curiosity about the future that continues to unfold with each step you take into terrain that belongs not to what was lost, but to what remains to be discovered.